There is a moment, history doesn't record exactly when a country decides who it is and who it isn't. In 1882, the United States made such a decision. For the first time, a law would name a people, not for what they had done, not for crimes committed, but simply who they were, and declare, "You are not welcomed here. You can never belong. This door is closed to you." But every story of a door slamming begins long before the hinges break. Before the riots, before the speeches, before the ink dries on the Exclusion Act. It begins in villages, half a world away, as sons who chose to leave so their families could live, with ships that cross storms and silence, with railroads carved through ice and dynamite, with men who built a nation that one day would ban them. This is the story of how hope becomes fear, how fear becomes hatred, and how hatred becomes law. This is the story of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
This episode is brought to you by the Fabric Cobbler. The Fabric Cobbler was created by Scarlett to carry fabric that no one else carries. The store is a safe place for all those who come. At the Fabric Cobbler, customers are family. The Fabric Cobbler is located at 324 East Roll Street, Forsyth, Illinois, or online at www.thefabriccobbler.com.
The story of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 does not begin in America. It begins in the humid river valleys of southern China, where bamboo groves whisper over flooded fields, and where the Pearl River snakes through villages that have known centuries of uncertainty. Guangdong, the ancestral home of most who would one day see Gold Mountain, was a land shaped by hunger and hope in equal measure. By the mid-1800s, China was living through a chain of catastrophes so relentless it seemed as if history had turned vengeful. First came the floods, water swallowing home after home, fields turning to brown oceans. Then came the drought, the sun burning the soil into cracked, dried lines. Famine returned like a reoccurring ghost. Rice baskets emptied, and mothers diluted porridge to fill more bowls. People sold pigs, then they sold tools, then they sold time, taking on debts that children would inherit like a curse. And over all this hovered the brutal presence of the Qin dynasty's failure, corruption, incompetent governance, and a bureaucracy that seemed to function only for those who could pay their way through it. But nothing crushed Guangdong like the Opium Wars, which ripped the region open. British gunboats shattered coastal defenses, ports were seized, economics collapsed. Refugee carts jammed roads, silver drained from households, leaving entire regions wallowing in poverty that felt permanent. It is easy to look back and think, why did they leave? But the real question, the one that hung over every river village, was, how could they stay? There is an old Cantonese saying from that era, when the boats leave the shore, it carries the whole family's breath. For thousands of young men, the decision to leave China was not an act of adventure, it was an act of obligation. The desperate hope that their departure would keep someone else alive. And then, across the ocean, a rumor arrived. A rumor so intoxicating it sounded like salvation. Guangdong, Gold Mountain, America. At first, it came as a whisper. The tale of a river where gold nuggets could be plucked like peaches from a tree. A land where 1 year of labor could feed a family of 10. A place where the streets glittered after rain because gold dust clung to the mud. The truth was far less glamorous, but truth matters little when the alternative is starvation. So Guangdong's villages began to change. Sons sold heirloom hairpins, jade bracelets, even their future daughters' dowries to afford a place on a ship. In dim tea houses, recruiters promised work and passage in exchange for labor contracts that often bore indentured servitudes. And still, men signed. Not out of naivety, out of necessity. Because in villages where families shared a single pair of shoes, even a lie that offered hope felt worth believing. By 1849, following the discovery of gold at Sutton's Mills, the whispers became a storm. The docks at Hong Kong and Macau flooded with migrants. The ships were not equipped to hold them. Some slept in cargo holds. Others lashed themselves to beams during storms. Rats gnawing ropes and toes alike. Crossing the Pacific meant 8 weeks in floating coffins, where disease swept through cramped quarters like wildfire. Men prayed not for fortune, but for survival. And yet, in every port, ships sailed full. Because across the ocean lived the promise that a son, through his suffering, could rescue his parents from theirs. Imagine stepping onto the San Francisco wharf in 1850s. The air tastes like salt and sawdust. Ships creak like old bones. The smelling of roasted meat wafts the street stalls. English, Cantonese, Spanish, Yiddish, Russian, a dozen languages swirl like currents around you. San Francisco wasn't a city, it was an explosion. A place built in a hurry, where fortunes were made and lost between sunrise and sunset. Its streets sank under the weight of mud, sewage, livestock, and dreams. Wooden buildings sprouted faster than they could be nailed together. Into this chaos stepped the first wave of Chinese migrants, stunned, exhausted, clutching bundles of clothing and letters tied with twine. They had arrived at Guamsan, the golden mountain of their imagination. But what they found was not a mountain of gold, but a world of contradictions. Yes, gold existed, but it was buried deep, requiring backbreaking labor. Yes, opportunity existed, but it would be rationed by race. Yet, in those early years, before the winds shifted, America was largely too busy, too chaotic, and too desperate for labor to care who did the work. And the Chinese did the work. The myth of the West, the railroads, mines, and frontier towns cannot be told without the Chinese migrants who carved its foundations. In the mines, they descended into shafts where the air grew thin, swinging picks until their hands bled. They scavenged, tailing abandoned by white miners, and still wrung gold from them. They cooked in cabins without chimneys, washed clothes in icy streams, and stitched cuts that should have been seen by doctors. In the fishing villages, they dried shrimp under blazing suns, hauled nets in storms, and built an industry that fed both coasts. In the towns, they opened laundries, herb shops, boarding houses, restaurants, and small groceries. Work the white population's view as women's labor, which ironically made it acceptable for men who needed income. And on the railroad, here the Chinese legacy is legend. Thousands blasted tunnels through the Sierra Nevada with black powder and nitroglycerin. They carved pathways through mountains that screamed with ice and granite. They hung from ropes, detonating explosives inches from death. They froze in snowdrifts so deep they swallowed entire work camps. The Central Pacific Railroad executives were astonished. What the Chinaman cannot do, one wrote, cannot be done. By the time the Transcontinental Railroad was complete, the Chinese had done the most dangerous labor and received the least credit. At Promontory Summit, where the final golden spike was driven in 1869, not a single Chinese worker was invited to the ceremony. History often forgets the hands that built it. During the 1850s and 60s, Chinese communities grew in San Francisco, Sacramento, Portland, Denver, and smaller mining towns. Chinatowns developed not because of self-segregation, but because Chinese migrants weren't allowed to live anywhere else. White landlords refused to rent to them. White miners banned them from claims. White unions demanded their exclusion. And yet, for a time, the economy needed them too much to push them out completely. So, the Chinese lived in fragile limbo, welcomed enough to work, unwelcomed enough to fear. This tension simmered for years, like a pot left on a fire waiting to boil. And then the nation reached a breaking point. The same country that had invited Chinese laborers to build its wealth suddenly Cancuned into economic collapse. And in America, economic collapse always searches for someone to blame. In 1873, the United States plunged into a devastating depression. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, factories shuttered, unemployment surged, white working men demanded answers, and politicians, desperate for survival, offered them one. Not the bankers, not the railroad barons, not the companies that had underpaid both white and Chinese laborers. No, they blamed the Chinese. The rhetoric grew vicious and theatrical. They steal our jobs. They do not assimilate. They are an inferior race. Newspapers portrayed Chinese men as diseased criminals, carriers and invaders, and threats to white womanhood. Carticulage showed rat-like faces and demonic features. Ministers preached racial separation. Labor leaders built entire careers on anti-Chinese hysteria. The same hands that had built America's railroads were now described as hands that were destroying the nation's future. As the economy worsened, mobs formed. In Los Angeles, 1871, a mob lynched 19 Chinese residents, one of the largest mass lynchings in the United States history. In anti-Chinese riots across the West, Denver, San Francisco, Tacoma, Rock Springs, Chinese homes were burned, businesses looted, people beaten, shot, and forced out at gunpoint. Local laws multiplied. Taxes on foreign miners, bans on Chinese women, licensing fees designed to choke businesses. America was no longer simmering. It was boiling. And politicians, smelling advantage, reached for the pot. By the late 1870s, a national movement had begun taking shape. One organized, well-funded, and politically irresistible. It spanned labor unions, politicians, newspapers, civil organizations. Its message was simple: the Chinese must go. San Francisco's Working Men's Party shouted at its rallies. California's politicians wrote it into state platforms. Newspapers printed it as gospel truth. Congress, smelling opportunity, began weighing options. America was preparing to do something unprecedented: to identify a single ethnic group, declare them unfit for the nation, and write its exclusion into law. The pot had boiled over. The door that had once promised opportunity was about to slam shut. Not quietly, not gently, but with the force that would echo through generations. When the 1870s began, the United States was exhausted. The Civil War was finished, but its wounds had not healed. Reconstruction staggered. Freemen struggled for rights while white supremacist terrorist groups surged. The economy lurched between chaos and hope, and the nation, already raw, already frustrated, felt stretched thin. Then came the Panic of 1873, the worst economic collapse the nation had ever endured. Banks collapsed like houses made of sand. Railroads went bankrupt. Unemployment spread like smoke. Men who once earned steady wages stood in bread lines. Families skipped meals so children could eat. In a nation used to imagining itself as unstoppable, this failure felt like humiliation. A humiliation demanding explanation. Politicians blamed foreign financiers. Newspapers blamed corruption. Whispers blamed immigrants. And then, gradually, methodically, the blame focused on the Chinese. Not because of evidence, but because they were visible, because they were different, because they were coveted. California had always been a place of contradictions. It promised opportunity, yet guarded it fiercely. It welcomed newcomers, but only if they did not threaten the established order. It relied on Chinese labor, while resenting how indispensable that labor had become. By the mid-1870s, nearly 1 out of every 8 residents in California was Chinese. To white laborers who faced unemployment, it seemed like a threat more than a statistic. And in that volatile landscape strode a man who loved attention almost as much as he loved an angry crowd. Dennis Kernley was an Irish immigrant, a failed businessman, a charismatic speaker, and a man who understood something crucial about politics. Anger is easier to rally than hope. He found the Workmen's Party of California, transforming his temper into a political movement. He spoke in parks, on docks, in public squares, anywhere he could find men desperate enough to listen. He was paced like a boxer. He punched the air when he spoke. His speeches were part sermon, part riot, part performance. And every speech ended with the same words, shouted until the crowd screamed them back. The Chinese must go. It didn't matter that the Chinese were paid less because employers exploited them. It didn't matter that the Chinese workers had zero political power. It didn't matter that a scapegoat was easier to blame than a corrupt railroad tycoon. What mattered was this: the white workers wanted someone to blame for their suffering. Kernley gave them a target. Crowds grew, threats grew, violence grew, and Kernley kept shouting. Every generation has its myths, stories built not to reveal truth, but to justify fear. A belief that Chinese immigrants were not individuals, but a threat, a swarm, a tide, a future takeover. Newspapers printed grotesque caricatures, Chinese men with elongated skulls, hunched backs, and rodent-like faces. They were shown as thieves, disease carriers, corrupters of morals. The irony? The same paper had once praised Chinese workers as industrious, sober, and reliable. But in a depression, praise is a luxury. Fear is cheap. Editorials declared, they steal our jobs, they undercut our wages, they cannot assimilate. Laws followed. Taxes designed only for Chinese miners. Licenses for only Chinese laundry owners that had to pay. Restrictions on Chinese testimony in court, meaning they could be attacked with almost no legal resource. Violence followed too. The 1870s and early 1880s became an era of terror for Chinese communities across the West. Their homes were burned, their businesses looted, their families threatened, and often they were forced to flee at gunpoint. Los Angeles, 1871, the massacre. It began with a gunshot. It ended with one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. 19 Chinese men and boys were dragged from their home, beaten, shot, and hung. The crowd watched like it was entertainment. Barely anyone was punished. Denver, 1880. Chinatown destroyed. A bar fight turned into a mob of hundreds. One Chinese man was beaten to death, dozens injured. Almost every Chinese business was destroyed. Denver newspapers blamed the Chinese. Tacoma, 1885. The Tacoma Method. Local leaders, including the mayor, organized an official mob. They marched through Chinatown, rounded up hundreds of Chinese residents, and forced them to walk 10 miles in freezing rainstorms. Their homes were set on fire behind them. The city celebrated afterwards. Rock Springs, Wyoming, 1885. The massacre. White miners, angry at Chinese workers, had been hired at lower wages, murdered at least 28 Chinese miners, burned their shacks, and chased survivors into the desert. The federal government did nothing to punish the killers. These were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern, a message, a campaign, a continent-wide effort to make life unbearable enough that Chinese immigrants would leave their own. So lawmakers would not need to pass a national law. But the mobs weren't enough, and politicians wanted more. As the West erupted, Washington, D.C. scrambled to respond. Senators from California and Nevada, the Pacific delegation, introduced bill after bill demanding Chinese immigration be halted. Their speeches rang with apocalyptic warnings. The Chinese are a threat to civilization. They corrupt white labor. They degrade American womanhood. They cannot become citizens. Some said Chinese immigrants were overrunning America. Others claim they were slaves in all but name. Most of the claims were lies. All of them were effective. Congress dismissed reports commissioned by the federal government, reports that concluded Chinese workers were not the cause of unemployment. Why? Because fear was more politically profitable than facts. In the late 1870s, an uncomfortable truth settled across America. The question wasn't really about labor, it was about belonging. Could Chinese immigrants even be considered American? Could they be accepted as equal? Could they even be part of the nation's story? For many white Americans, the answer was no. Their reason disguised themselves as economic. But underneath lay the bedrock of exclusion laws: race, culture, identity, fear of others. America was a nation that still didn't know how to integrate difference. A nation still wrestling with the aftermath of slavery. A nation terrified of being changed by the people it had welcomed. And so, step by step, speech by speech, riot by riot, the momentum shifted. The idea had begun as a rally chant on a wooden crate gained legitimacy, becoming a political platform, became a congressional promise. The mob had prepared the ground. Now Congress was ready to seal the door. By 1880, the pressure was unstoppable. A petition from California flooded Congress. Editorials demanded action. Workers marched with banners. End Chinese immigration now. Political parties realized the issue was a goldmine, not for the Chinese, but for votes. And so, one by one, lawmakers switched sides. Republicans, Democrats, East Coast politicians who had never met a Chinese immigrant in their life, Southern politicians eager to protect white supremacy, Western politicians fueled by rage, all aligned around one idea: a national law must be passed. The only debate left was how harsh it should be, and soon, the country that had invited Chinese immigrants to build its railroads, the country that had profited from their sweat, the country that had stood on their labor, would decide it no longer wanted them, not as workers, not as neighbors, not as citizens, not as people. The storm was ready to break. Inside the halls of Congress, the air feels heavier than usual, thick with cigar smoke, thicker with intention. Papers shuffle, voices raise. A law is being forged, line by line, not from justice, but from fear. A senator leans forward and says, "If we do not stop them now, we may never stop them at all." He is not talking about criminals. He is not talking about an army. He is talking about people who built the railroads, washed the clothes, cooked the meals, mined the hills, fished the coast, and held together the fragile bones of America's West. A vote is about to be cast. A door is about to be closed. And a nation is about to redefine who belongs inside its borders and who must remain forever outside. The early 1880s, the United States had moved past the debate, past the discussion, past the function that this was merely a labor issue. It was now a political certainty. If Congress had not acted, the mob would have grown. If Congress had not acted, the Pacific states would have revolted. If Congress had not acted, any politician who resisted would have paid with his career. America was ready to write fear into law. But the Chinese Exclusion Act did not appear fully formed. It emerged from a tangled web of diplomacy, deals, speeches, and pressure, a convergence of forces that made the outcome feel inevitable. Even so, there were moments, small, fragile moments, where history might have turned another way. But it didn't. Before Congress could ban Chinese immigration, the United States needed a diplomatic excuse. China and the US were still bound by the Berlin Treaty of 1868, which promised free migration and mutual respect. China viewed America as a rising power, one worth cultivating. America viewed China as a source of labor. But now that treaty had become an obstacle. So the US sent James B. Angel, former university president, polished diplomat, to renegotiate. His mission? Convince China to allow the United States to restrict Chinese immigration. China, weakened by internal rebellion and foreign pressure, agreed to negotiate, reluctantly. The result was the Angel Treaty of 1880. It allowed the US to limit, suspend, or regulate the immigration of Chinese laborers. Not ban, not exclude completely, just limit. But as soon as the ink dried, congressional leaders looked at the treaty and said, "Good, now we can ban them." The treaty was not a compromise. It was the opening of a legal door, one Congress intended to slam shut. In early 1881, Congress introduced a bill that shocked the Chinese government, a 20-year ban on Chinese immigration. This was no limitation, this was an ultimatum. China sent formal protest. Chinese ministers pleaded with lawmakers. They reminded America of treaties, obligation, and friendship. But those words carried little weight. Most lawmakers viewed China as weak, a nation beaten by Western powers, a people without leverage. The House passed the bill with overwhelming support. The Senate followed. The law was ready. Only one thing stood in its way: President Rutherford B. Hayes. He understood the mobs, the violence, the pressure. He knew California's politicians wanted this more than anything. But he also knew the United States had signed a treaty that did not allow total exclusion. And Hayes believed, almost quantitatively, by 1888 standards, that treaties mattered. So he did the unthinkable. He vetoed the bill. He wrote that the law violated America's word, that treaties must be honored, that a nation must uphold its promises. Congress raged. California burned his effigy. Newspapers mocked him. He was jeered as the man who loved the Chinese. His veto did not stop the movement. It delayed it. But history remembers moments like these. Moments where one man tries, however briefly, to hold back a tide. Hayes left office soon after, and the tide returned. James A. Garfield became president. Briefly, his assassination brought Chester A. Arthur to the presidency, a man few expected to defy Congress. Arthur was a political survivor, a machine politician, a product of patronage and favors. He had little reason to stand against exclusion, but he did, for a moment, when Congress sent Arthur a second bill, again proposing a 20-year ban on Chinese immigration. He hesitated. He said it went too far. He warned that such a ban would damage America's international reputation. Then, astonishingly, Arthur vetoed it. The West erupted in fury. How dare he? What right did he have? Who was he to stand in the way of their demands? California's leaders declared the veto as an insult. The Working Man's Party gathered crowds and screamed Arthur's name as if it were a curse. Congress returned with a compromise. Not a 20-year ban, a 10-year ban. The Chinese Exclusion Act. And this time, Arthur signed it. History turned. On May 6, 1882, the United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first significant federal law to target an entire ethnic group by name. The law banned Chinese laborers from entering the United States for 10 years, required every Chinese person already in the U.S. to carry certificates of registration, made Chinese immigrants ineligible for U.S. citizenship, allowed only a tiny number of merchants, teachers, students, and diplomats to enter, prohibited every Chinese laborer who left the U.S. from returning. In plain terms, it was a gate with a lock, and the key was thrown away. The act carved out racial categories, Chinese laborers, and declared them unfit to enter the nation. It did not matter if they were honest, hardworking, skilled, desperate, law-abiding. Their identity itself was a crime. Across the West, the law greeted with explosions of joy. Church bells rang in California. Crowds cheered in Nevada. Newspapers published triumphant editorials. Politicians held parades. Dennis Kernley declared victory. Labor leaders shouted, "We have saved white civilization." But in Chinatown, the mood was different. Merchants gathered in meeting halls, reading the news in silence. Men wrote home to their wives that they might now never see again. Sons realized they were never bringing their parents to safety. Families, already split across oceans, were now sealed in separation. One Chinese man in San Francisco wrote, "America invited us to build her. Now she throws us away." The sadness did not come from surprise. The signs had been clear for years. It came from hope. Hope that America would choose fairness for fear. Hope that the violence was a phase, not a destiny. Hope that the Constitution would protect them. That hope was misplaced. The Exclusion Act was not symbolic. It had machinery. Officers, inspectors, surveillance. Chinese immigrants faced interrogation at ports, constant checks of registration papers, harassment by local sheriffs, inability to testify in court in many states, denial of re-entry, even when legality permitted. Federal courts became battlegrounds, with Chinese residents fighting for basic recognition of rights. Some cases reached the Supreme Court, where justices debated whether the government had the power to exclude an entire race. The court's answer would soon come, and it would be devastating. China was humiliated. A treaty ally had publicly declared Chinese people unfit for its shores. Diplomats protested. Newspapers in Beijing and Canton denounced America. Chinese workers abroad wrote home in shame and anger. And yet, China's government, weakened, fracturing, could do little. The United States had shown its hand. Economic desperation plus radical fear equals political power. And other nations watched closely. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Within a decade, many would pass their own exclusion laws targeting Chinese immigrants. Then, Japan immigrants. Then others. The Chinese exclusion law did not just change America, it changed global immigration policy. It redefined what it means for a nation to set its borders based on race. As the act came into force, American newspapers declared the Chinese question settled. But a question shut behind a locked door does not disappear. It waits. Behind the act, people kept living, kept working, kept surviving, kept resisting in quiet ways. And their story, the story of life exclusion, is where we gotta go next. There is a room on the second floor of a brick building in San Francisco. The windows are shuttered. The air is still. The walls are lined with portraits of men whose names you've never heard. In the center of the room sits a wooden chair. Anyone who sits in it becomes a suspect. It is 1887, 5 years after the Chinese Exclusion Act. A boy, no older than 13, sits in that chair. His feet don't touch the floor. His hands tremble in his lap. The translator whispers to him, "Answer carefully." Across the table, a white American immigration official clears his throat and begins reading from a list of questions that seem to go on forever. How many windows in your home? What color were the tiles on the roof? What direction did your mother face when she cooked? How many steps from the village well to your family's door? What is the name of the family living 3 houses to the east? The boy tries to remember. He tries to speak clearly. He tries not to cry. Because one wrong answer, any hesitation, any detail slightly off from what someone else said, he will be sent back across the ocean, alone on a ship where people die. This is not Ellis Island. There is no welcome here, no promise of a new life. This is what the Exclusion Act created, a system of suspicion, interrogation, surveillance, and fear. A world where Chinese immigrants were allowed to remain in America only by proving, again and again, that they had the right to exist. 1882 was not the end. It was only the beginning. The Chinese Exclusion Act didn't just halt new immigration, it created an entire regime and an early blueprint for American immigration control. For the first time in U.S. history, a federal agency kept detailed files on one nationality. Photographs, family histories, affidavits, interrogations. It was a system built entirely around one idea: keep the Chinese out, and for those already here, keep them contained. Certificates of identity. Under the Act, every Chinese resident in the U.S. had to carry papers. Certificates of residence, later called dog tags by Chinese communities. If you were stopped on the street and didn't have your papers, prison, then deportation. No other group in America lived under these rules. Not Italians, not German, not Irish, not Eastern European Jews, not Mexicans, not Canadians. Only the Chinese. It was the first national ID system in American history, and it applied only to one race. Imagine the West Coast in the late 1800s. San Francisco, Seattle, Portland. Ports bustling with new industries. Railroads reaching towards the horizon. Mining towns, fishing villages, farms, factories. And in all of them, special federal agents whose single job was to hunt down Chinese immigrants they believed did not belong. These agents raided laundries in the middle of the night. They demanded papers in the street. They questioned people in their own homes. They searched boarding houses, farms, railroad camps. They followed tips from neighbors or rival business owners. He does not belong. She came illegally. They're pretending to be related. Agents tore apart homes looking for hidden photographs or letters. They seized documents. They arrested anyone who hesitated. Some agents became infamous. Names whispered in Chinatown with dread. One was Matthew Patrick, the Chinese hunter. Another, John Shrine, who bragged openly about catching immigrants. They measured their success not by justice, but by deportations. The targets were not criminals. They were barbers, fishermen, cook, merchants, daughters, sons. The people trying to live quiet lives. To enforce the exclusion, the government invented a new technique, the interrogation, but not the kind used in police work. They were far more elaborate. Every Chinese person entering the US and many leaving were subject to questioning that could last hours, days, even weeks. They were asked the number of graves in their village, the exact shape of their alleyway, the name of every neighbor within 5 houses, where the village pigs slept, what fruit trees grew behind each home, where the family kept firewood, the direction of the marketplace door. These questions were designed to trap people. They were nearly impossible to answer perfectly, and they were different each time. Many officials believed any Chinese arriving would lie by default, and so arrivals were threatened like criminals. In 1904, a young man named Wang Yongpeng was interrogated for 8 days straight. No accusations, no lawyer, just pressure. Another man, Li Suri, was questioned so long he fainted twice from exhaustion. Children cried, old men begged, women were humiliated in front of strangers. It was called immigration. In reality, it was an architecture of exclusion. When the US closed its gates, Chinese communities adapted. They found cracks in the system, small, fragile openings, and slipped through them. The most famous workaround was the creation of paper sons and paper daughters. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the city's records burned. Birth certificates, family registries, all destroyed. Suddenly, thousands of Chinese American men could claim they had been born in the US. And if they were born here, you could bring over your children, which meant you could claim more children than you actually had. Those false children became paper sons and daughters. Young people in China given new identities, memorizing fake family histories for months before attempting passage. They studied, invented siblings, imaginary courtyards, fictional neighborhoods, non-existent windows, every square foot of a house they had never seen. They drilled day and night to prepare for interrogation. Some succeeded, some were caught and deported. All of them risked everything. Paper families were acts of resistance, a way to survive in a country that tried to erase them. The Exclusion Act froze Chinese communities inside a strange kind of limbo, present but not allowed to belong. Men without wives, because the act banned immigration of laborers and heavily restricted women, most Chinese communities became overwhelmingly male. In many cities, the ratio was 100 men to every 1 woman. Imagine entire towns filled with bachelors, eating dinner alone, sending money home, writing letters to wives they had not seen in decades. Some marrying on paper but never meeting their spouses. Some dying alone with no family to bury them. Chinatown became worlds of longing. Without wives or children, communities struggled to grow. Associations, benevolent societies became makeshift families. Elders took in young men, friends formed bonds stronger than blood. But the structure of American law made Chinese America a community of ghosts, present yet temporary. Despite everything, Chinese immigrants did not stay silent. They fought relentlessly in courts, and some of the most important civil rights rulings in American history came from Chinese lawsuits. Yik Wo versus Hopkins, 1886. A Chinese laundry owner challenged a racist city ordinance in San Francisco. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor, establishing a landmark precedent. Laws that are race-neutral on paper but discriminatory in practice are unconstitutional. This case shaped civil rights laws for generations. United States v. Wong Kim Ark, 1898. Wong Kim Ark, born in San Francisco, left for China to visit family. When he returned, the U.S. tried to stop him, claiming his race made him ineligible for citizenship. The Supreme Court ruled, anyone born in the US, regardless of race, is a citizen. Without this case, the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship case might have collapsed. These victories did not end exclusion, but they built the foundation of American civil rights laws. The Chinese, even while excluded, helped define what American citizenship was. Under exclusion, deportation was constant. Some were arrested at work, others while visiting friends, others on trains or ferries or walking down the street. Federal agents used surprise raids, bursting into restaurants, checking papers mid-meal, arresting workers in laundries, detaining people for days without explanation. Families feared every knock on the door. One bakery in San Jose kept a trapdoor in the floor so workers could hide instantly during raids. Some homes had false walls for the same reason. Children learned to run when they heard heavy boots. This is what law enforcement looked like for Chinese immigrants. By the early 20th century, the interrogation station in San Francisco moved to a new location, Angel Island. For many Chinese immigrants, Angel Island became a place of fear, hope, heartbreak, poetry carved into walls. Men and women were held for days, weeks, sometimes months, waiting for interrogations or appeals. Some were deported without even stepping foot onto the mainland. One detainee wrote, "Imprisoned in the wooden building, day after day, my freedom withheld. How can I bear to talk about it?" Another carved, "Even the silent night cannot quiet my sorrows. The moon shines, but I cannot return home." Angel Island was the Ellis Island of the West Coast. But it was not a doorway. It was a filter, a prison, a barrier, and for many, it was the end of the dream. The exclusion era wasn't just about laws or interrogations on paper. It was about lives. Loneliness, men who lived 40 years without seeing their wives. Wives who waited for letters that never arrived. Children raised by grandparents who felt their fathers only through faded photographs. Silence. Families kept secrets, paper names, invented histories, stories never told, even to their children. Fear. Every letter, every knock, every step outside carried the risk of deportation. And resilience. Despite it all, communities built temples, theaters, newspapers, business districts, opera houses, and entire cultural worlds. They survived. They endured. They held on. The Chinese Exclusion Act was originally supposed to last 10 years, but Congress renewed it again and again until it became permanent. For 61 years, Chinese immigration remained nearly impossible. For 61 years, American law declared Chinese people unassimilable. For 61 years, generations lived in limbo. Many Americans today don't even know this era existed. But the consequences shaped the landscape of immigration law, race relations, and civil rights in ways still visible today. Exclusion was not just a law, it was a system, a worldview, a story America told itself about who belonged and who didn't. In 1943, during World War II, a U.S. telegraph operator sent a short message across the country. Just a few words. The Chinese Exclusion Act had been repealed. It was symbolic, limited, far from true equality, but for thousands of Chinese Americans who lived in fear for more than half a century, that message meant something simple. The door is open, even if only a crack. In the early 1940s, the world was on fire. Japan swept across Asia. Nazi Germany was devouring Europe. And the United States, preparing to enter the war, needed allies. One of those allies was China. Suddenly, the country that had been labeled unassimilable, undesirable, unfit for citizenship, became strategically valuable. American newspapers began to shift tone. Politicians who had once demonized Chinese immigrants now spoke warmly of the gallant Chinese people. Hollywood joined in. Heroes with Chinese backgrounds appeared in war films. Propaganda posters depicted the Chinese as noble partners. It was an awkward transformation, a 60-year story rewritten almost overnight. And as the US sought to strengthen its alliance with China, one law loomed like a stain: the Chinese Exclusion Act. China's leaders privately pressed the US to repeal it. American diplomats, embarrassed, described the law as an obstacle and a relic. In 1943, Congress passed the Magnosium Act, repealing exclusion. But the repeal was not what it seemed. The quota, 105 immigrants per year. That was it. A number chosen not for fairness or justice, but for symbolism. A whisper of a door opening. The rest of the structure of the exclusion, surveillance, interrogation, proof of family ties, remained intact. The law was gone. The system was not. For Chinese Americans who had lived decades under exclusion, repeal did not ease the past. Because the act had done something deeper. It had reshaped entire family trees. The bachelor generations, those lonely streets of early Chinatowns, 100 men for every woman, became a demographic scar. Even by the 1940s, many elderly Chinese men in America had no wives, no children, no relatives, no plan for what would come next. Some had paper marriages. Some had families in China that they had not seen since the Qin dynasty. Some died alone, buried by clan associations or benevolent societies. They were the last of their generation, a generation caught in the storm. The paper sons grew old. Those who had come as paper sons carried secrets for a lifetime. Some never told their wives. Some never told their children. Some buried their false papers on their wedding day. Some hid them under floorboards for decades. Living in America meant living with a split identity. The name on the documents and the name in your heart. Two identities, two stories, two lives. And when the paper sons grew old, a new fear appeared. What would happen when they died? Would their descendants lose the truth forever? This fear brought something unexpected. Families quietly transferring secrets before it was too late. A grandfather, near death, whispering, "My real village was not the one I told the officials. I had two brothers, not one. I changed my name because I had to." For many families, this was the moment when the Exclusion Act reached across time and touched the next generation. There is a word in Cantonese. It means to bury, not just physically, but emotionally. Many Chinese American families buried the trauma of the exclusion era. Parents stayed silent. Children didn't ask. Grandchildren didn't know. Why? Because silence had become a survival strategy. For 60 years, to be Chinese in America was to be watched, questioned, and suspected. So families learned not to speak of the old country, not to draw attention, not to mention paper names or false identities. When the second and third generation grew up, some felt they came from a blank past, a story of missing pages. A grandmother who refused to talk about her childhood, a grandfather who never said his parents' names, a family tree that ended abruptly in 1882. The Exclusion Act did not just restrict immigration, it restricted memory. It broke the storyline families passed down and replaced them with silence. Even after the repeal, the logic of exclusion stayed embedded in American legal system. Broader enforcement, the idea that one nationality would be surveilled, interrogated, and monitored because a template. Later, immigration systems, for quota, to border checks, to visa categories, borrowed techniques first used on the Chinese. The concept of illegal entry gained meaning from exclusion, because the Chinese were the first people widely prosecuted for unlawful entry. The idea that papers deemed worthiness, that comes from the exclusion era. The federal immigration bureaucracy. Before 1882, immigration was local. After exclusion, it became national. a centralized system with filing cabinets filled with case records, photographs, certificates. The U.S. immigration bureaucracy was born through racial exclusion. It would grow into a complex system we know today. One of the cruelest legacies of exclusion was the families who never reunited, the lost children. Some men in America discovered too late that their children in China had died of illness, famine, and poverty, long before they could bring them over. Some women waited decades for husbands who would never return, not because they didn't want to, but because the law made it nearly impossible. Paper names, real consequences. Family trees became puzzles. Some branches doubled or tripled. Some names disappeared. Some people became legally related to strangers. Some relatives could not legally acknowledge each other. A person might have a real father, a paper father, a real brother, and a paper brother. A real village, a paper village. Imagine trying to reunite a family after that. Some never did. After repeal, Angel Island changed roles, but the ghosts remained. Former detainees returned as elderly visitors, walking the old wooden floors, touching the carved poems with shaking hands. One man, now 72, traced a poem he wrote as a youth. Days in prison are long and bitter. I pace the room, alone with my grief. He whispered, I thought I'd die here. A woman who had been detained as a teenager brought her granddaughter. She pointed at the interrogation room and said, that is where I learned how to lie. She meant it literally, learning answers, memorizing details, performing a script, just to be allowed to exist in America. Children of detainees grew up hearing stories. The locked doors, the barracks, the crying in the night, the deportations, the long walk to the interrogation room. Angel Island became a memorial site, not just to exclusion, but to survival. In 1943, only a few hundred Chinese immigrants gained citizenship. In the 1950s, a few more. In the 1960s, thousands. But the true breakthrough came when the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which finally ended nationality-based quotas. Families began to rebuild. Wives came to reunite with their husbands. Children met fathers for the first time, sometimes as adults. Whole villages emptied out as residents moved to join relatives in America. Chinese American communities transformed. No longer bachelor societies of laundries and restaurants. Now, family neighborhoods with schools, churches, associations, playgrounds. But the shadows remained. The trauma did not vanish. It shifted from grandparents to parents, to grandchildren who wondered why their family story started so late. For many descendants of the paper sons and daughters, one question lingered. Who were they before the papers? Some searched archives. Some traveled to the ancestral villages. Some pieced together clues from old letters. In one village, in Tinashan, a man returned with a photograph of his father's paper name. The village elder squinted and then said, "That is not his name. I knew your grandfather. Your family moved away in the famine years." A whole branch of history opened. Another woman found her real family registry in a dusty village temple, her great-grandfather's name carved in stone, weathered but readable. Some found cousins they never knew existed. Some discovered stories their families had hidden to protect them. The Exclusion Act had erased their identities, but generations later, some were reclaimed. The Exclusion Act is often forgotten in American history books, but its logic, the fear of outsiders, racial gatekeeping, legal exclusion, has resurfaced at different points with different groups. Chinese exclusion was the beginning of an American long struggling with immigration and race. Its echoes linger. Debates about who is fit to be American, suspicion of foreign influence, surveillance of immigrant communities, political movements that blame newcomers for economic problems. The past is not the past. It is a mirror. And when America looks into it, it sees shadows of 1882. At Angel Island, a final poem stands near the center of a brick wall, carved by an unknown hand, maybe a boy, maybe a man. Translated, it reads, "The journey brought me to this island. My fate lies beyond my control. But though the road is blocked, my heart still seeks the horizon. The Exclusion Act tried to stop a people. It failed. It tried to erase their stories. It failed. It tried to define who could be American. It failed. Because generations of Chinese Americans reshaped that definition with their labor, their love, their families, their perseverance. The act is gone, but the people remain. The road was blocked, but the horizon was never lost. History is full of doors. Some open, some close. Some slam shut and echo for generations. The Chinese Exclusion Act was one of those doors. But a door is not destiny. A door can be unlocked, removed, rebuilt. A door can be replaced by a bridge. And every time a descendant asks, where did we come from? What did we endure? What are our names? They push the door open a little more.
This episode is brought to you by the Fabric Cobbler. The Fabric Cobbler was created by Scarlett to carry fabric that no one else carries. The store is a safe place for all those who come. At the Fabric Cobbler, customers are family. The Fabric Cobbler is located at 324 East Roll Street, Forsyth, Illinois, or online at www.thefabriccobbler.com.